Welcome to the New Books Network.
Hi, my name is Rachel Stewart. I'm a PhD research student at the University of Kent, and this is the latest in our special series of sex work and sexualities. And with me today, I've got Barb Brent, Tila Sanders, and Chris Wakefield, who are going to talk about their new book, Paying for Sex in the Digital Age. Can you introduce yourselves and tell us about your areas of expertise, please?
Okay, thank you, Rachel. My name is Tila Sanders. I'm Professor of Criminology at the University of Leicester. Bob?
I'm Barb Brent, a professor in sociology at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas.
And I'm Chris Wakefield, and I am a PhD candidate in sociology at the University of Las Vegas, Nevada as well.
And you're all very, very welcome. So let's get into the book, because it's an awesome book and I sort of read it yesterday. Can you tell us what the aim of the book is, please? Yeah. I mean, if we start with Tila and go around, maybe.
Okay, so it's a big piece of work, but I think the overall aims are about we've got some fantastic survey evidence that we'll talk to you about and a little bit more, but it's showcasing some empirical data. There is not much in this area, so it's really about looking at the customer element, the consumption side of sexual services, and it does a whole range of things in relation to trying to find trends and patterns across the UK and the US, looking at situational as well as individual factors. And within that, there's broader aims to debunk myths, stereotypes, think about what the broader sex industry is. Often the provider is talked about a lot, but not the consumption end. And it is really trying to expand our knowledge of that element of the sex industry.
Okay, and it's an element that's just totally ignored. And when it is mentioned, it's just totally demonized. Barb and Chris, have you got anything else that you'd like to sort of like add to what the aim of this book is?
No, but I mean, of course, I will say something anyway, because I think what's so important about this book is the fact that it's filling a gap in the knowledge that we don't have about clients, in spite of the fact that there are increasingly attempts to try to regulate or eliminate the industry by criminalizing clients. So there's a lot of assumptions about what clients are and how they act and what they do. And our goal was to give some evidence-based research into the policy arena.
Excellent. And Chris?
Yeah, I'll point very much to what Barb and Tila said, but I'll also add there's some lovely extras that come along with this book besides just looking at the data. So for me, despite being the person brought on primarily to work on the data, I'm a bit of a theory head, and a lot of work on clients of sex workers doesn't involve a lot of rich development of theory, and so we attempted to correct some of that as well. We have lots of ideas and propositions that we hope will be influencing sex work client research for the next decade or two, things that you don't often see, stuff like discussing life course perspectives for clients, examining temporal aspects of client interactions, and also consumption and market patterns. It's stuff that you do not often see in this area. We hope it's sorely needed. We hope that it's going to make it's going to change the way we talk about these subjects in academia.
Yeah, and I think it's really important, because if the narrative of the sex worker has been hijacked by sort of feminist discourses, well, then the narrative of the actual customer has been totally silenced and demonized. And I think this is way overdue. And this was why I was so enthusiastic to actually read the book, because they're voiceless, aren't they? We just don't, they're just cast as these kind of, abusers or manipulators. And we don't really get to hear anyone's experience. So, yeah, I'm really excited. So you describe in the book, you describe at length using the comparative studies of sex work consumers. Sorry, let me start again. You describe using the comparative studies of sex worker consumers in the two different countries, America and the UK. Can you tell us about the surveys, please?
Yep, I'll start off with the UK one. So this was part of a broader project called Beyond the Gaze, which is looking at online working practices, safety and regulation, funded by the Economic and Research Council. We did client survey slightly as an adjunct because our focus is very much on sex workers, but we realised to understand the internet and online activities, we really needed to have some knowledge about the customers as well. So in 2016, we had a survey out there for 3 months. And surprisingly, we got 1,323 responses, which we were really, really happy about. It certainly is in Europe the largest survey database on clients at the moment. It is very much a white survey sample. We just left it there. We didn't particularly do any hard recruiting. It does affect, I think, a broader issue of the book in relation to who we're talking about, what the data is. You know, they're very much white respondents, and we have to reflect here. These are people who completed online questionnaires mainly. I think that was the case entirely for the US as well. So it does reflect here's the digital divide, and we have to think about broader social and economic inequalities in relation to access to digital and confidence with that digital and belief that that digital, anything survey related, is confidential and anonymous as we would put it out. It's important to note with this comparative element is that in the UK, sex work broadly is legal, despite it being criminalised in the context. But in the States, obviously, it's a highly illegal context. But we've got two surveys that were different and they didn't ask entirely the same questions, but we've managed to bring them together and use Chris's expert skills to do statistical analysis on two quite different databases. Barb and Chris can talk to the US.
Yeah, in the US, we started off, your listeners may or may not know that in the US, Nevada has several counties, which are the only places in the US where sex work is legal in legal brothels. It's kind of a small industry, but we started out actually wanting to understand clients of legal brothels. And so we started an online survey to try to get at that. And we quickly realized that many of the clients of the legal brothels also paid for sexual services in other markets. So we expanded it to the whole array, and we managed to get just under 1,000 usable responses to our survey. So in combination, this is a pretty huge deal. But like Tila said, our respondents as well were about 87% white. We oversampled the brothels, but legal brothels, but we didn't oversample or try to get at consumers of street markets and other non-online markets. So it really just captures folks that are savvy with the internet. But what's also important to say here is that we conducted the survey before FOSTA SESTA took hold. And as you know, FOSTA SESTA was a bill that was passed in the US to attempt to criminalize online advertising of sex work. So the survey and our understanding of clients couldn't have happened after that was passed. But thank goodness we were able to gather that data before then.
And Chris?
Yeah, I mean, those are the lovely big broad strokes. In terms of other ways in which our sample might be differentiated compared to other research on clients, absolutely our data leans wider. And when we discuss the topic of the sample, we should recognize that when we look at representative samples, neither of which of these are representative samples, in part because you can't possibly create a a representative sample of this topic, really. But our samples, because they are gathered from specific communities, we did our recruitment, both the UK and the US survey. The recruitment methods generally involved promoting these surveys on spaces where clients tend to gather. So in the UK, that included client review sites. In the US, that actually primarily worked through places like Twitter, which is where many clients were connecting with sex workers in their area. Not just the brothels. We ended up expanding that effort. And so the results ended up with a group that's not only whiter, but is also a fair bit older. You would expect that with an online survey that might skew younger in our data, but actually it's quite the opposite. It skews older. And part of the reason why that is because both of these surveys are not just surveys of just anyone who buys sex work. At least in part, they are surveys of consistent or veteran buyers because of the way we recruited that sample, which makes this data perhaps even a little bit more unique. Because these are folks that are harder to get in touch with. These are not the folks who are necessarily being picked up by the police here in the United States. Typically, those are first-time buyers that are younger, less experienced, don't really know how to buy sex safely. And so our sample, when we talk about who it represents, it's really important to acknowledge who we captured in those methods. We also managed to catch, at least in the US sample, we managed to catch a surprising number of women. It's not just men in our sample. Both samples have at least some women. The UK sample, I think, has a total of 13 women in it, which is not very much given that sample size. But in the US, I think we had 41, which is actually a surprising number. And so we're able to at least look at some basics with those, even if we can't do anything complicated with it. And so besides white and besides men, which is the sort of standard skew that you would expect, we also know that our sample earned more money on average, both in the US and the UK. It's more extreme in the US. And we also know that they are a fair bit older. I think in the UK, the average age was 48, and in the US, it's 50. Okay. And so as you can imagine, that's going to shift the range of several things. But that is a lot more characteristic of the folks who buy consistently as opposed to, otherwise. We oftentimes assume that the folks who are buying sex are not going to be the wealthiest or most educated. We assume that they're not going to be they're not going to be sort of the more successful people in society, but actually when we look at veteran buyers, they tend to be wealthier, they tend to be more educated, they tend to be more capable of supporting what turns out to be sometimes a fairly expensive activity to do on the regular.
Yeah, that's quite interesting. So in your survey, were people buying sex in a variety of different ways? Like I haunt adult work. I'm constantly trawling through adult work. And what I've noticed when you press on people's feedback, so you press on the sort of the sex workers' feedback, you can see all the people that have left feedback for them. Okay, so you can see the buyer's feedback. When you click on their feedback, you can see that they're actually purchasing sex in lots of different ways. So you'll have people that will, for example, will use webcamming and phone chat and a variety of different ways of buying sex online. Is that what you found in your survey as well, that people were using the internet to purchase different types of sexual experience?
I want to say real quickly, but yes, absolutely. As I said, we were surprised to find that people at the legal brothels were also purchasing in a variety of other markets. And so one of the unique things that our survey was able to do is to see the variety of places and the frequency measured in kind of different ways of how often people go to different markets. But what was really unique about the UK survey is that they also took care to look at consumers of webcamming and all sorts of online venues. Ours tended to focus on just full service, usually face-to-face sexual services. And so Tila can talk about that a little bit.
So in Beyond the Gaze, we asked about non-touch sexual consumption. And so we had a whole section on people who could answer as a webcam user. And we really explored here and had some open-ended questions too, to think about the remote purchasing process. And obviously this was pre-COVID situations where it probably was possibly less prevalent as it is now at 2 years on, 3 years on. So the remote purchasing, and we really were able to explore in that qualitative data as well, the whole issues around intimacy online and all that contested notions around intimacy and digital technologies, which in the sociology literature has been quite stark for several years. But we really wanted to use that space to explore both the continuity around intimacy, but also new understandings of intimacy through the webcam and what that digital terminal does in the provider seller consumption relationship there, and what are those patterns of sexual consumption. So we were able to find out a lot more, and interestingly, it does mirror some regular patterns around purchases of webcamming going to the same models, camera on, camera off, these kind of anomalies. But we really have been able to explore in the book a little bit more theoretically, using that empirical data, the reshaping of intimacy in that non-contact, digitally facilitated environment, which I think, there's not that much been done. Hopefully there'll be a lot more as people studying webcamming continues to thrive in the sociologies. So we have been able to look a little bit more at non-touch, which has been quite interesting and quite exciting.
Yeah.
Hey, I have a question that I wanted to ask the two of you, because I can't remember now, but it seems to me that the crossover between folks that were customers of webcamming and customers of full service sex was not as big as we would have thought. Can you all talk about that?
Yes.
Can I say something about that? Because when I interviewed 35 webcam performers for my research, what I found is that there was a really massive crossover. Like 5 of the women that I interviewed, and bearing in mind, people that respond to interviews generally respond because they're particularly interested. But 5 of the women that I spoke to had started relationships with, full-on relationships with people that they'd met online. And a lot of them had seen their customers online as well. They're using it almost as like a street corner, So that was quite interesting. But I think what was really interesting in also, I interviewed the CEO of StreamMate, and I also interviewed an affiliate owner, and they both mentioned that they felt like they were kind of commodifying loneliness. They mentioned the times of day that people were logging on as being, those times generally that you would reach out for a partner. So I in my experience, I'd found that there was quite a big crossover, that women themselves were using different formats, but also they were definitely using the webcam to connect with their customers. Chris, I wondered, if you could respond to that question as well.
So when it comes to webcam, I'm like flipping through part of the book because I don't fully remember this part myself. But my impression, my memory, and correct me if I'm wrong, Tila, is that for us, let's see, it's about a third of the UK sample had engaged in, had watched live webcams. And I don't recall whether or not we specifically tested how many of them engaged in webcams and nothing else. And so maybe Tila has the answer to that question off the top of her head. But yes.
Yeah, so there's about a third of the respondents said that they had only watched webcamming.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, that's quite interesting.
But what was interesting, can I just carry on? So what was interesting when we asked them what type, and I guess this is the evolution of that type of market, which has clearly moved on since 2016. But we asked them about, is it just the free public shows? Do they tip? Do they not tip? Do they ask for private shows? Private shows two ways. So really getting into the mechanics really of how that market works online. And clearly now that there's a lot more creativity around that webcamming experience now as things have moved on online, and there's been a lot more creative types of platforms available for people to engage with. But we're really trying to get to some of the nitty gritty of what are those relationships. Are they passive? Are they active? Is there longer term relationships with people who only meet each other online? And what is the nature of that? What is the social or the sexual or the sexual? But as you can imagine, masturbation was a key part of that interaction, even if there was preferences for some more social interactions as well.
And Chris?
Yeah, to add on to that, I think maybe perhaps the most important part of the book for this was some of our exploration of qualitative data, actually, because we had respondents who were talking about what it meant or what they valued most about the webcam experience. And some of those features mirrored in some really important ways some experiences that we identified in qualitative comments for direct contact sex work. And a lot of that had to do with building emotional connection with the webcammer, building relationship with the webcammer. We oftentimes have this stereotypical vision of sex work being a situation in which a guy doesn't care about the woman. He's just there for the pleasure. He comes in, he pays for the sex. He gets his hour, he has his fun, he walks away, and there's no real social interaction. There's no connection building. And a lot of what we found, especially in the qualitative comments on our survey, of which I believe both of our surveys had plenty of qualitative comments to offer in, had a lot to do with how do I get access to something that really builds a degree of emotional connection. I want to feel like I know a person. I'm not just looking to get off. I want to feel like I'm engaging. I want to feel like I'm interacting. I want to feel like I'm supporting. And sometimes that evolves in little ways. For example, one client just emphasizes the importance of eye contact. This one little thing that takes an experience away from, watching a pornographic film and into the realm of human interaction. For others, they really wanted to know about their cammer's life. And the same is true for a lot of those in-person contacts. Many of the clients that wrote in on those qualitative comments really wanted to not just have the girlfriend experience the GFE or just have a good time, but they actually wanted to have a longer term relationship of sorts. And to be clear, before I just drop that statement and walk away from it, nobody is confused in these surveys about what that relationship is. They understand that it's a commercial relationship. The vast majority of these folks are not selling themselves a bill of goods, thinking that their sex worker is in love with that. That's not the sense that we get from these qualitative comments, though some people in these debates tend to think of it that way. They know what it is, but they are still looking for an emotional connection as part of that consumption relationship. And that is a really dominant, consistent thing that we keep finding, both quantitatively and qualitatively.
Yeah, I suppose.
Can I just read out a quote from one of those? So a quote in the survey was, we talk, we laugh, we joke, and even cry about the ups and downs of our private and public lives, talk about our experiences from the past, where we are now, and what we are intending for the future. It's very common to share similar life values. For instance, a popular theme for both parties is, quote, we're unlikely to find our ideal partner on a drunken nightclub dance floor at 3 a.m. Also, if I haven't seen them in many months, they still remember our last conversation and what we are getting up to in our lives at that time. And that's from somebody who uses webcam.
Yeah, in my experience with like talking to webcam performers as well was that, you know, that they would develop a relationship over a long period of time, and that relationship would morph, you know, like whatever particular sort of demand the customer was making tended to morph over time, so they would evolve, you know, and that's what I got. Can you talk us through the way the book frames demand? Because you spend quite a lot of time talking about demand, and that we get that debate around demand, around the kind of radical anti-sex working sort of debate. So how does the book discuss demand?
Actually, that was a really important point that we wanted to make in the book. I think our main thing we're trying to get across is that demand is not just, all you got to do is stop a consumer and then they'll stop, and then you eliminate demand, and then you eliminate the industry. Demand is complex, and it involves a lot of different layers, and that's part of what our main point. It's situational factors matter. Things like where in one's life course one is, how much money you have available, how easily or difficult it would be to contact a sex worker who provides the services that you want. Not just writ large, how hard is it, but how able are you to find as a consumer what you want. I mean, I think in a lot of ways, demand is as complex as demand for any kind of consumer service in our culture today. And we are increasingly living in a culture in which there is a market for connection and adventure and excitement and all the level of things that you can have provided for you through the kind of sexual services that are offered. So it's not just things like life course. I mean, does somebody want to access services when they're on vacation traveling away, or do they want someone close by? And all of these things matter. It's just a really complex kind of a thing.
Yeah, I think also we wanted to kind of frame or reframe the ideas of demand, and to kind of speak against the notions that eradication would be a way or a solution for safety or improving violence against women and girls or reducing trafficking or modern slavery, and to actually think about customers as part of the solution. Some of these atrocities that happen in society against sex workers. So we spend a good chunk of the book talking about how clients can help reduce harm and reduce exploitation, and explore this controversial idea of responsible consumption. Now, this is clearly not a new concept, and it's applied to all elements, particularly in relation to environmental consumption. But if we're thinking about responsible consumption and how clients can be using the cases against violence and against coercion, then it's flipping the traditional harmful discourses around customers often on its head to think a little bit more about ethical consumption, what that is it possible, how can it be achieved, and to have those more forward-thinking, pragmatic discussions and debates. Then you have to engage in, what is the customer, what are they there for, how can we facilitate safer sexual services between consenting adults. So we really do go into that a little bit more in the book.
Yeah, and to build right off of what Tila was saying there, in order to do that, we have to have a pretty solid understanding of those different market experiences. When we talk about sex work consumption, we oftentimes tell ourselves a very simplistic story about how that's done. We tell a story of, driving up and picking a person up off the street, or we tell a story about, perhaps if we're a little bit more informed these days, we might tell a story a more modern story about finding an advertisement online. But the reality is that, as we said, clients are engaged in multiple markets. And so in this book, we take great pains to try and figure out how can we better organize a conversation around market preferences? How can we better organize a conversation around the choices that folks are making? And this is key because the conditions of the sexual economy are various now. People have choices. It's different from the 1940s and 50s where you don't have networked access to a variety of options. You have a choice if you're going to go shopping for sex. Would you like to use online methods? Would you like to look at folks' websites? Would you like to access a client review site and see what other people are saying? Would you rather explore some of your local environments and see maybe there's a massage parlor in your area? Perhaps you'd prefer something more like that doesn't involve connecting through your digital identities. Maybe you'd prefer to consume in a more public place, such as a bar, which is sort of a common, more old school way of making those connections. And each one of those comes with a very different experience of sex work. And so when we have historically told the story of these consumption practices, we assume that there's really not a whole lot of options. You do it the way that is legal or safe or consistently available to you. But adding in, as Barb was saying, the ability to travel adds a whole nother element to this. And we saw in both of these surveys a tremendous amount of variation. And so in order to better make sense of that, because this group is so diverse, because these market preferences are so diverse, we decided to organize some of these groups into sort of subtypes. And these subtypes are not perfect, but they are a helpful way to progress our thinking in terms of those market preferences. And if you wanted to create policy around ethical consumption, that policy actually has to fit the sorts of market preferences that people are engaging in. If we're going to do that ethical consumption with folks on review sites, well, we have some mechanisms that we talk about in the book for that. We can talk about how clients themselves enforce rules and promote values in those spaces for ethical management. We can also talk about outreach that we could be doing in those spaces to ensure that if somebody observes something that looks like forced prostitution, that they have access to a safe mechanism to communicate their concerns. I encountered this woman. I think that she's being coerced into this work. Here's a reporting mechanism that I know won't get me in trouble. Mm-hmm. There's some elements of that, I think, happening in the UK. That's really not available in the US. It's very dangerous for a client to try and report that. And then when you look at other venues, you would take other policy approaches. You have to build with your space in mind, and that's a big part about a big thing that we're trying to do in this book is we're really trying to make sense of those different venues and really think of them as consumer choices. And when you shift that thinking towards consumer choices, we have a lot more options, and we have a lot more. We come up with different policy prescriptions for trying to improve those situations.
Yeah, I was really struck by this section, because I think what happens with these really binary debates is that we forget that actually the worker herself creates demand. Yeah, it's not always just a demand for a service; it's often a demand for a particular person. And when I've spoken to people that are working, say, for example, online, a customer is particularly taken, will buy all of her products across a range of different formats. So he'll webcam with her, buy like video clips, he'll buy pictures, those sorts of things. They go across, quite often the demand is created within the interaction. The interaction itself is dynamic. It's not one pussy fits all. It's like, it's like they create that demand. Also as well, it's really interesting with what you were saying about ethical sort of like customer use, because I've done a lot of research interviewing street women, and I interviewed a woman who'd actually been trafficked, and she'd been freed from this flat that she was working in because our customer had gone to the police. The customer had reported her situation. And I think that these types of discussion help us to rehumanize everyone in the equation. It rehumanizes the sex worker as being dynamic and able to create demand for who she is, but also as well it makes the customer more dynamic. I think it's just a really important discussion to have around demand.
If I could add one other thing too, is the ability to look broadly like this at statistics and big surveys and big picture, is you begin to see sort of the ways in which things fluctuate and the patterns in which they fluctuate across many different settings. And I think that an additional problem then with the ways in which we have conceptualized demand and assuming that there are no multiple factors affecting demand, demand is uniform, which is what our book is showing is completely not true, is that if you don't pay attention to that, there are unintended consequences of what your policy can do. In the US, we want to get rid of demand by criminalizing clients. Well, one of the things you notice in the differences between the US and the UK survey is that our clients tend to be wealthier. So when you criminalize it, you make it so that those with the most resources can access the services the way they want to and do so safely and outside the law with money. But then the ones that are, and you eliminate this sort of middle range of folks who are who want to do this the right way. And then at the other end then are those who may want to break the law and don't pay attention to the client, the sex workers. And so it's like you either you squeeze out the middle in a sense when you criminalize it.
Yeah.
And that just all adds to the discourse of disposability, this idea that only the elites can access sex work in a legal context. So it does set up sex workers to be targeted, to not be paid, to have the negotiation disrupted, and just increases that whorephobic discourse, which ultimately puts people at harm. So it does have really unintended, dangerous consequences.
Or arguably just pushes everyone behind a paywall, because it seems to me that Foster and Sisters is entirely blind when it comes to webcamming. I mean, I can see us getting to a stage where any sexual engagement happens behind a paywall and that goes through the banking system. It's a kind of herding.
Justin, can I just make one comment around our older clients, because I find this as important part of what we found out in terms of new sociological knowledge, flagging up that the surveys do really demonstrate sexual services being purchased by older cohorts. Now, this obviously feeds into broader knowledge around changes in sexual behaviours and sexual attitudes in the fourth stage of life. But, a quarter of the UK sample was 61 years old plus. And the interesting thing there was, when we talk about consuming sexual services, on average, most people only bought sex 3 times a year, apart from the older age groups. So the older age groups were the ones that were much more regular in purchasing sexual services once or twice a month. And this is quite interesting in terms of dynamics and thinking about consumption across the life course, and with that older age stage being a trigger for engaging in sexual consumption. So obviously from a public health point of view, you're thinking about, it's the older cohorts who have the largest increases in STIs at the moment. So just thinking about that older cohort and what it means in relation to buying sexual services, and often starting it when conventional relationships change in that later life, then purchasing sexual services either start or are restarted or increase. So for me, it's that older cohort is really quite interesting epidemiologically. And we should be thinking about that in an interdisciplinary way, to think about the older groups of people. What I really want to do then is think about how does this influence supply, who are supplying sexual services to this group of older men. I don't imagine it's all 18-year-olds. I can't imagine that it is just that. And does that mean that there's more older people, older women staying in sexual services, providing to this older group of men? So that dynamic, is there an interaction there between who is entering the sex industry, who is staying on longer to provide sexual services or sexualized services, so to speak? So I think that's a really fascinating part and finding from the data, and hopefully something we can go on to explore further.
Yeah, I would imagine sort of from what you're saying, that you'd have to take into account as well. What really speaks to me about the demographic of this research is also the people. It's time consuming to fill out research. Yeah, to fill out a research. So you've got to be, one, motivated, and two, have the time to do it. So actually what you're finding as well is that the people who've got time to respond to the survey are the older people. Yeah, and it's almost a reflection in the UK context of how much more sort of financially comfortable the older generation is than the younger generation. But also, I suppose you've got that thing as well, and I can't remember what her name is, and she talks about how we network everyone nowadays. So you're used to networking people. So younger people may not be responding because they're more used to accessing people in a networked way, and not necessarily sort of like responding to it. Because my thought is this: is you have to be really motivated by your sexual experience, either good or bad, to respond to a survey that you're not being paid to respond to. So you're talking really about customers who have had a significant experience, aren't you? Or have got the time to talk about it. So yeah, that's what struck me.
Well, I think I mean, you're probably right that we probably, if we had magically been able to have a representative sample, we may have had a younger population as well. But it's really important that I think that the older you are, the more income generally you have in order to purchase these things.
Yeah.
Our sample had disproportionately unmarried people, and I think most surveys of clients have found that compared to the population as a whole, clients are less likely to be married. So you've got folks that are at a stage of life where they may not have a partner, or as some of the qualitative data from our survey found, their spouses may be sick or may be unable to have sex, and many have given permission. Many are in open relationships. I think it's important, as Tila was saying, not just to think that those are the folks that answer our survey, but to try to understand that older men are an important client population here, and in need of, as Chris talked about earlier, intimacy and emotional connection and that sort of thing.
Have you got anything to add, Chris?
Barb and Tila really nailed this one on the head. But I will say there's a couple additional things that I think are very interesting about this older client population. First and foremost, there's the relationship portion that is quite valuable. Relatedly, there's also the topic of disability, which is more likely to be experienced by our older clients. And disability is one of those few areas we don't actually have, unfortunately, too much data when it comes to disability, but disability oftentimes came up in our qualitative comments. And we had folks who are, older men. Some of them are war veterans with visible physical injuries. Um, Others are just physically unfit or requiring wheelchairs, things like that. And these are things that many seem to be identifying as reasons why they simply can't access sex in a regular, consistent fashion, or even struggle to have sex with an established partner with. Um, and so these older populations are also going to be disproportionately uh, dealing with a loss of ability to participate. And one of the things that they seem to identify about sex workers is that many of them, or at least perhaps some specialized sex workers, we're not really sure how specialized or not this activity is, but there seems to be at least some sex workers out there that are very good at handling folks who have physical limitations when it comes to having sex. One gentleman in the U.S. survey explained that he was in a wheelchair and he was very heavy set, and there were a couple women in particular that he stuck with, and the reason why he stuck with them is because they were, as he put it, very good at this. And when I say very good at this, I don't mean very good in bed. They're very good at seeing past my wheelchair. There's another gentleman in the U.S. survey who was a military war veteran, and I don't remember this quote exactly off the top of my head, but he had very visible battle wounds that was very sensitive, as you can imagine. You lose an arm or something in battle, and that's very difficult. And to imagine trying to date when you have something like that that's holding you back from being considered conventionally attractive. And in these cases, these men are finding both emotional and physical solace with sex workers who really understand what it is to feel as though your body is a detriment to you. And we don't necessarily think of that as an experience for sex work and sex workers and sex work clients, but it seems to be making a significant difference in some of these older populations. Disability itself becomes a really important topic as well.
Yeah, it fits really nicely into my next question as well, actually. You write at considerable length about masculinities in the context of purchasing of sex. Can you tell us how the book explores this?
Yeah, what's interesting about the contemporary research on masculinities is the findings about, and this I'm talking generally and not just sex work related, but masculinities are changing, and increasingly men are the notion of hegemonic masculinity, which still exists. There is still a dominant form of masculinity, but increasingly it's really formed in as much in relationship to other men as it is in relation to women. I say that because the concern about sex work from many quarters is that men build their sense of masculinity based on dominating other women. They are not women, therefore they must control other women. And this is sort of the main critique of the sex industry, is that it's a manifestation of this kind of masculinity. Well, what research is increasingly finding is that men build masculinities in relationship to other men, other marginalized groups of men, as well as against each other. And when we look at, for example, the attitudes towards women among the clients in our survey, we find that they're actually much more egalitarian in their attitudes towards women. Chris and a number of folks and I have another article that we published recently just looking at attitudes towards women and gender equality. And you find that they're actually more egalitarian in their attitudes as measured in this survey than is the population as a whole. And what that is when you're, there's a tendency is when you're getting something that you need from women, you respect service providers. And that is evident in a lot of the qualitative responses that we see, and a lot of the other research, that there is an appreciation for other women that is fostered when you depend on a service that you pay for from them. It's just not the case that you automatically tend to objectify. And this reflects changes in the way men are acting generally.
Yeah. And I think we need to really reopen that conversation about objectification, considering we now live in this networked society where we objectify each other all the time in every single sort of context. And I think it's Nussbaum that talks about objectification can actually be quite nice. It's like, I don't mind being objectified in the right circumstance, as long as it doesn't stray out of that circumstance. This is really quite, everyone likes likes, everyone likes likes. Yeah, so the book talks about the impact that digital technology has impacted on the sex industry. Can you talk us through this a little bit, Chris?
Sure. So the digital world has made tons of changes to how folks consume sex historically. As I had mentioned earlier on, our original version of sex work in our heads comes kind of like from this 1950s, 1960s, 1970s. At least in the US anyway, I can't speak for the UK, but in the US, our perception is, slow trawling in your car in the dead of night, down some back alley street, inviting someone in to your car and then driving over to a motel, something like that. But for most of our participants, this is the least likely scenario for how they're going to consume sex these days. And part of that may have to do with sampling. Obviously, we targeted folks who are already active on the digital sphere. However, we did find a significant number of persons who have used street contact as a method, but even when they did, it was often infrequent. There's probably a variety of reasons for that, at least in the US. Most notably, it's probably the easiest way to get caught. And so if you had your first experience there, you're less likely to want to do the most risky thing first and choose that as your primary method. Today in the digital sphere, most of the folks both in the UK and the US speak very strongly in support of using online methods as a safe alternative to connecting with sex workers. And it offers some particular benefits that really make it for a lot of these clients. First of all, it offers an ability to sort of not preview what you're getting, but you can engage with what other people have said about this sex worker. I mean, think about whenever you want to buy something yourself, one of the first things you probably do these days, if you're going to go to Amazon or whatever, is you scroll to the bottom, you look at the rating, you look at the stars, you look at the comments and say, oh, what was good about this product, what was bad about that product. In some ways, that is now available for sex work in a way that folks were unable to do before. Yeah. And in so doing, I mean, there's newfound complexities to that, right? For both the sex worker and the client. Clients can post reviews that are not very flattering, with ulterior motives besides just trying to honestly inform other clients. But meanwhile, other clients can push and enforce a more positive set of values in that space. There's pros and cons on both sides, and I'm sure we'll talk about that. There's also more security and privacy available in these spaces, because you can email a client, you can negotiate things before you ever get there, right? You can set forth expectations right from the get-go. Everyone knows what the score is very easily. That being said, technology also brings new risks. We had the UK sample in particular asked questions about scams and other sort of bait and switch experiences. Many of the clients who responded in the UK sample identified situations where they had a picture of one person, they arrive, there's another person, or they arrive and there's someone else there. Some folks pointed to what's sort of like a newer version of an old school scam, which is that you arrange a time in a meeting in a place and someone comes in and it's either not the correct person, but they still try and get the money. And then after they get the money, they say, oh, there's somewhere I have to be. I have to go somewhere, or there's someone there to collect the money, and it scares the person off. These scams are difficult to detect at first. Client review sites sometimes are helpful for dissuading these, but not completely. It seems like many of our clients run into these sorts of threats and risks. And there's never really a clear answer what to do for clients in these situations. Many folks, the first sign of trouble, they just skip off. And this is also a situation where, again, we can talk about moments of exploitation. While I think all three of us think it's a mistake to overemphasize the role that exploitation plays in this industry, none of us would deny that it exists. And certainly our clients ran into that as well. Client reviews are sometimes helpful for that as well, because clients will acknowledge, they'll also learn from their fellow clients how to identify what might potentially be exploitation. So some of our clients acknowledged, oh, I came to this situation, I saw this red flag, I saw that red flag, even if it's something they never tried to go through with in the past, they can sort of recognize it immediately because they have that knowledge that they gained partially online. So there's a tremendous number of changes that are happening on the digital front.
I wonder, did you talk about their engagement with the actual platforms that they're using? Because my experience with talking to webcam performers is that a lot of the really exploitative practices that they come into contact do not come from the customers. They come from this totally kind of no workers' rights environment that this sort of criminalization creates. So, in the context of webcam performing sites, if you contravene the webcam hosting site, the performer contravenes the webcam hosting site in any way, her account can be just suspended right there and there. And any money that she's got in that account, most people take their money out once a week, once a fortnight. The money's gone. And I wondered if the customers had ever talked about any unfairness that they'd perceived on the actual platforms where they engage with the sex workers.
These are all good points, Rachel, but we didn't ask as in depth around their engagement with the web platforms. No. Obviously, this is 2016, the Beyond the Gaze one was, and lots have changed in 5 years now online. So it'll be very interesting to see. But my take is, from speaking with customers, is that they have less engagement. It's much more complicated for the provider than it is for the seller. And they may have had reviews taken down, or they may have even had their accounts closed. But there is less interaction with that interface than there is for the providers.
Yeah. It just occurred to me that maybe they'd experienced it. So we've covered a lot of the questions that I wanted to ask. You sort of floated into them quite naturally, which was nice. So who is the book written for? Who's your audience? Who are you aiming for?
Well, academics, other researchers, because we, in a lot of ways, we see this book as a broad sweep, a big overview, and something that we hope will spur other scholars to asking more deep and detailed questions about. So at one level it was to other folks who research the sex industry. It's also to maybe other folks generally who are interested in sex work and interested in the field, and probably most importantly to policymakers or to those who try to influence policymakers, because the evidence-based research is so important to the policymaking process, and we have very little published research on clients. It's starting to grow, but not enough. So our hope is that policymakers and folks who are trying to educate policymakers can find this book useful.
Yeah, I thought it was really brave, like pioneer book. I really did get a lot from it. It was, it definitely prompted questions for me. It did definitely prompt questions for me. I found a lot of things that really echoed with my research, but also there was other stuff that came through that I really wanted to explore more. Like I remember speaking to the CEO of StreamIt, who's totally scratching his head because he cannot understand why StreamIt can't make any headways in India. He's like, everything's there. You've got this up and coming middle class. You've got this, you've got internet connection. It's like, can't work it out. And I'm like, well, people aren't living on their own. It's the same way with the studios in places like Romania and Colombia. I went to Romania randomly, and people are working in studios because people are living together. So you have to go out to work. You can't work from home, say webcammers do in the Northwest context. So I think it's a really important sort of book to explore outside the Northwest, the global Northwest as well. I think it was, it prompted as many questions for me as it answered. So this is the final question. What are you currently working on? What are you all sort of brewing up? Because I know that you are just you are just on fire, constantly, sort of creating new sort of stuff in the industry. I'm going to start with Chris. Chris, what are you doing?
Gosh, I wish I was on fire as Barb and Tila were. So I came onto this project, and clients of sex work was not my original plan for doing work, and so my work deviates a little bit from Barb and Tila's. So I'm currently collecting data for my dissertation in sociology. And that dissertation is on how individuals who are on public sex offender registries adapt to regimes of surveillance and social control. And so I'm looking at the ways in which they actively change or pursue different options, given the fact that they are oftentimes shut out of major social institutions on a daily basis. And so you can imagine that there are some hints of relationships. Some clients might experience being on the registry later on if they are caught, depending on state and local regulations here in the United States. But it's a fair bit broader than that. I consider this work to be part of a broader oeuvre. I sort of connect issues of sex work with a larger discussion of what David Halperin and Trevor Hoppe have called the contemporary war on sex. They argue in their text that this work, that there is still very much a war on sex, that the liberalization of sex and sexuality in Western society did not erase any sort of war on sex. In fact, it's just that the targets are different. The characters and the cast members have changed somewhat in recent years. And so I consider both this work and that work to be part of a broader mission of recasting and understanding contemporary social control mechanisms for sexual behavior long-term across one's life. And so that's my primary focus. I am probably still going to be working on some publications from this data as well. So I'm not done with this, despite the fact that the book has been out for a while. I have to get my own data collection going before I can come back to it. So that's essentially what I'm working on. I'm also, as of only a couple of days ago, I've started to partner with the Williams Institute, which is a group outside of University of California, Los Angeles,
that studies LGBT issues from an empirical quantitative framework. And so they're doing work on sex offenders, which is sort of how I connected with them. But I hope that I hope my collaborations with them will continue beyond their current work into sex offender issues.
So will this just be from a sort of sex offender point of view, or will this be looking at the impact of, say, on sex workers who've been, you know, sort of prosecuted, how that impacts their life course?
So this work is a I mean, I will likely deal with clients of sex workers in the project, but I'm dealing with the whole kit and caboodle when it comes to folks on the registry. So everyone from people who have committed crimes that most of us would consider to be heinous, all the way to unjust and falsely committed or convicted. Sorry. So I'm really dealing with the whole range there. And part of the reason why I'm not really engaging in any kind of debate about whether or not any one person's behavior is acceptable is that it really doesn't matter for the purposes of understanding a regulatory regime whether or not we think those activities are just. We simply need to understand how those regulatory regimes are working in the 21st century. Yeah. In part because the mechanisms that we're using are likely to create adaptations that we probably, even from sort of a pro-criminal justice standpoint, are probably not the ones that we want them to make. So, for example, in the criminological literature, we're really interested in how do we get people to desist or avoid reoffense, right? And so we know some of the factors that do that, but the registry actually dissuades people from engaging in those factors. So the registry actually discourages people from dating, which could lead to a long-term marriage and a stable family life. It discourages them from seeking long-term employment. It discourages them from accessing any of the primary social institutions that might help stabilize a person long-term, give them a reason not to reoffend in the first place. And so I find it very interesting that our adaptations do the opposite of the things that we are hopeful to create in those populations.
Exactly. Tila, what are you up to? You're muted, Tila.
Lots of writing projects on various edited collections and special issues on decriminalisation, and about to announce with Angela Jones and Alina Shai that we are going to be caretaking a book series on sex work studies for Palgrave. And it's very much about putting those at the margins at the centre. So looking forward to facilitating that for the next decade. Watch this space on that one. And then various empirical projects, one with Barb, which Barb can talk about, which is sex work and sexual violence across 4 countries. And then doing quite a lot of policy and practice related work. So a fab little project on student sex work. University of Leicester have been the first university to have an inclusion policy for student sex workers, and I now have an outreach program to universities, training staff. We've got a team of 2 trainers, and we're very much informed by lived experience, and since January we've trained 300 staff in universities already, and we have waiting lists into June and July, so that's an 18-month project on student sex work inclusion, and then working with the police on their new refreshed guidance for 2022. The National Police Chief Council's there. So various projects going on in relation to impact and policy.
Excellent. And Barb, what are you doing? What are you up to?
Well, first I want to say what a incredible honor and privilege it's been to work with 2 of the most smartest, prolific, doing important research folks here, Chris and Tila. Chris is going to change the world once Tila and I are done, or continue to. And Tila is like probably one of the most prolific and active sex work scholars on the planet. So I am just a little cog in a machine here. But I do want to shout out the importance of Chris's work, because as he said, this war on sex, I mean, I don't know when this is airing, but just yesterday, there was a little bit of justice in the United States with the George Floyd case where police murdered a African-American man, a problem that is just highlighted the inequalities of our criminal justice system and the ways in which so many of our laws simply target with all sorts of paint on them poor and marginalized folks. And and as we're starting to pay attention to some aspects in criminal justice reform, thank goodness, I think we're squeezing our ire and the targeted laws to sex offenders, to clients of sex workers. I mean, just this legislative session in Nevada, we were fighting back, including Chris was doing this as well, fighting back a number of policies that sought to increase penalties against anybody in and around the sex industry in a veiled attempt to try and save and help sex workers. But we couldn't even get a bill passed in our legislature to decriminalize victims of trafficking because of this notion that you've got to arrest people in order to save them. And so it was ridiculous. So this war on sex is very real. And as we're thinking about criminal justice reform, it's really important to see the intersections with all sorts of populations. And so Chris's work is really important. And Tila, is a role model in many ways. And my hope is to take some of her work, especially convincing police departments to think differently around this and bring this to the United States. And so one of the projects I have the privilege of working on is this grant that Tila and a number of other scholars have gotten to compare sexual violence and the ways in which sex workers deal with sexual violence in the US, the UK, and New Zealand. And we're just starting this project, and it's going to be quite amazing just to look at what the regulatory context does to people's ability to actually deal with violence. So that's an exciting thing. I'm actually working on a couple of edited book collections, one of which I'm hoping to get published in Tila's series. I'm also working with a group of folks. We've got 250 scientists from around the globe to sign on to a statement that we sent to the Biden administration and to governors in various states across the country, saying, hey, when you're making policies, pay attention to the research. Scientists for Sex Worker Rights, as we call this campaign. And so we're hoping to follow the model that Tila and a number of other great UK scholars have done in trying to get evidence-based research onto the policy, to get policymakers to listen in the US, which is not something typically done. So that it's great that all this stuff.
Yeah, I think it's time that the governments look at the social harms that they're causing by their policies. They do harm, in their bid to rescue, they actually do more harm than rescue. After I finish this, I've got to write a coroner's report for a sex worker that died because there are no provisions. There are no provisions because exiting groups are just, taking up all this money nowadays, and just using it for their own political agenda. So anyway, on that rather somber note, thank you all. It's been awesome to talk to you. Can you just tell the readers the name of the book, who published it? I know it's available.
I'll go for it. Yeah, so it's Paying for Sex in a Digital Age, US and UK Perspectives, and it's Routledge, 2019, and it is available in paperback.
Excellent.
So go for it.
Thank you all so much. My name is Rachel Stewart, and I'm a PhD researcher at the University of Kent.